Welcome to Season 2, Episode 1 of the Inclusive Chronicles, Tips and Tricks for Inclusion in Alberta. The Alberta Teachers Association respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 territories, the traveling route and gathering place and meeting grounds for Indigenous peoples whose histories, languages, cultures, and traditions continue to influence our vibrant community. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and a gratitude to those whose territory we are residing on or visiting.
Right. We are so happy. We have Dr. Shelley Moore here with us for another episode of the Inclusive Chronicles. Just a quick introduction. If you don't know who I am, I'm Arlene Foley. I am your current president for the Council for Inclusive Education, and I'll hand it over to the ladies.
I'm Kelsey Bagnall, and I am the Communications Officer for the Council for Inclusive Education. And Hannah?
I already got an introduction. Let's go. I'm Hannah Jenkins. I am the Webmaster for the Council for Inclusive Education. If you're getting emails, they're probably for me.
And then you don't really need an introduction, Dr. Shelley Moore, but we're so happy to have you here with us. Just wondering, what have you been up to? It's the start of we call September the start of a new year, not January in the teaching world. So here we are at the start of a new year. And so I'm wondering, where are you and what have you been up to?
Yeah, so hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Where am I? Oh, well, currently I'm at my mother's house. I'm in her sitting room. Like you can see the blueberries. She loves the color blue.
We love the blueberries.
So I'm visiting my mom. My aunt is here from New Jersey. But yeah, August, September is the busiest 2 months of the year. And so I'm kind of here for a few days and then I'm off for a few days to a place. So I just got back from Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. And I was in Hamilton. And then this week I go to Palm Springs and Toronto. And then we're taking the whole family in Amsterdam because I'm working there for a week in October. So it's
how fun!
Super exciting.
So fun!
Wow!
I know, like, what is this job? I just I can't believe that every time I get invited to some place that like I didn't even think I would ever get to visit. I'm just like I just feel so thankful that this journey has led me to telling stories around the world. Like it's just so fun. So fun.
Have you ever done I've seen people who travel a lot, they have the big world map and they kind of put pins. Like you've pretty much been everywhere, I imagine.
It's so funny. It's like, how like wedding anniversary dates have like the wood anniversary, the metal anniversary. So for the wood anniversary, which I think is 5 years, maybe 4, anyways, whatever, the wood anniversary, I got Jessica a world map that has cork for the countries. Wood backward, but it was personalized to travel some more. Very clever.
And I love it.
Each of us have a little pin, and so we always get a family photo in all of our places.
We did at my last school that I was at last year. We were quite diverse, and so we did like a night, and we ended up we figured out we had something like 20 different languages in our little tiny school. So cool. And we did the world map, and we had kids come up and put a little pin where they were from, and it was so cool.
That's a great idea. But it makes you realize, like, we'll probably talk about this, but like we're so conditioned to like value homogeneity, and so to like purposely point out the diversity so kids can be like, wow, like look at us, like we represent so many different stories, and it's such a great way to capture the diversity in a way that celebrates, which changes that narrative, and so I love things like, or the schools that have like all the different flags of all of the countries, things like that. Like I eat it up. It's just so
what we did is we figured out all the languages. We had the letter translated in all of those languages. I even resorted to reaching out to Facebook. Put it on Facebook groups being like, hey, we're really looking for somebody who can translate a letter in Ilocano, and here's the reason why. and just community members were excited to do that. So we sent the letter home explaining like the food sharing night in everybody's home language, and there were like grandparents there who still couldn't speak much English, and they were just like so happy.
Oh, it's so
Brought in food. They brought in food from their culture and shared it, and it was like really magical.
That's it. That's what you
And
do.
now I'm not there.
It's okay. New sharing food night.
Yes, new beginnings, new beginnings. Speaking of new beginnings,
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about Outside Pins. I do follow you on social media, so I've seen a few things. I've been quite busy myself, so I'm just wondering if you could kind of share where you're at.
This is an interesting story because
shocking.
Ready for it.
So because I always have like 25 things on the go.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And someone actually pointed out to me recently, they're just like, Shelley, your executive functioning skills relies on two things. You know, either it's something you do now or it's something that you do not now. Right? And so I have like 25 things that are now, and then I have all these other things that are not now.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they become a now. There's no transition. And so when I first started this position of just like speaking and consulting and professional development, it was also kind of during the time when I was kind of figuring out, you know, what is my role in terms of storytelling, but also like what's my lane? Because I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't taking space for other people's stories.
Right.
Because that's something that drove me bananas when I was a teacher, is that people would speak for a group of people, but not be from that identity group.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Like having like a white person talk about critical race theory. I'm like, it's just not appropriate unless you're at least collaborating with, you know?
Yeah.
And so when I started to do this work, like I really asked myself, like, what is my lane? Like, what can I speak to? And I'm like, I can speak to being queer. I can speak to having a learning disability. I can speak to, you know, growing up poor and, you know, navigating some mental health issues. And there's so much intersections there with so many other things. And so that's something that's always been on my mind. Like, I really want to make sure that I'm not taking the space of someone else's story. And so understanding that my research is in the area of intellectual disability, like that was always something that was just kind of like, but I don't have an intellectual disability. And I know, and I can appreciate that there is a place for research in lived experience, but I always kind of had this like vision that like one day I want to use my platform to create space for other people's lived experience, to have a place to share that, right? So I always kind of had that percolating, but I couldn't manifest it. And then what started to happen was, and that's years ago. So it was kind of like when I'm done my PhD and when I'm done, you know what I mean? And my kids are a little older, maybe like that will be kind of like where I go. And I had mentioned it to a few people, and I'm like, we could be the Outside Pins, you know? And that was kind of the idea. And then what started to happen was I got really busy, as we do.
Yeah.
And you got really busy.
Yeah, no, and I have to say no to people all the time, and I hate it. And so people are like, why don't you train people to share your message? And I'm like, because I don't believe in that. Like, I don't want anyone to ever think that I offer training. Like it's completely contradictory to the whole concept of inclusion, which is responsivity. And it's not about everyone doing the exact same thing. Like that's not what the integrity of inclusion is. I'm like, I don't want to create more me's.
Right.
And so I was just like, I don't know. So I just kept my like outside pin idea for a while. And then I get stuck in a car with Katie Novak in traffic for 2 hours. Now, if you know Katie Novak, she's the smartest person I know, but she talks a mile a minute. So, I mean, we packed a lot in that 2 hour traffic jam. And she just said to me, she's like, what's your plan? And I'm like, what do you mean, what's my plan? To raise wonderful children? She's like, no, what's your plan with your business? She's like, what are you doing? Because she has a whole enterprise.
Yes, she does.
That's her pace. She operates on enterprise pace. Like I can barely keep up with her. I love her. I learned more from her in 5 minutes than I have been in a decade, because like she's brilliant, you know? And so we're talking and she's just like, what's your plan? Like, are you going to expand? Like, what's going on? And so I told her all this about like my dream of outside pin and the tension I had with trainings. And she's like, no, Shelley, you don't have to train people to be you. You just have to find people that align with you
There
and
you
get them to
go.
talk about something that they're as passionate about as you are, but that you don't have the experience with. And then the door in my brain opened that was stuck, which was, this is the lived experience opportunity. Because I was focused on intellectual disability, but I'm like, I get to talk about, I'm not an early child educator. I could get an early child educator in here. I'm not a parent of a child with a disability. I could get a parent of a child.
There you go.
And so then Katie Novak, she's like, make a list of 5 people right now, like in the car. So I'm like people who I know are so aligned and live the work of inclusive and equitable practices, but have a passion or a research or an experience that's different than mine. And I'm like, I didn't sleep for weeks.
You're like, this is the thing. This is the thing we're going to do.
This is how it's going to work. And so when I was sitting with Katie Novak, we basically talked about, okay, so I want to get, like, we talked about the big list, but like the short list, just to start with, because we're piloting, is I want to get a parent. I want to get a researcher. I want to get a teacher, and I want to get a self-advocate. And so our first 4 are those people who are all aligned to inclusion, but have their distinct and unique lived experience that we can provide the stage for, but also, pay them and make sure that they have the support and the mentorship to be able to share their message. And I'm working with each of them on kind of collaboratively creating a presentation that's their story to share. And it depends, like some of them are 20 minutes and some of them are a full day. And I'm learning so much from all of these people. But the part that I didn't realize in all of this is that like the whole like context of consulting is quite lonely. Like you're traveling by yourself. There's no lunchroom. There's no
It's kind of like the opposite of like message.
Well, exactly. And also like that's what kept me going when I was school-based was the community that you had. So it's like it's very isolating. And all of a sudden we have this little community, this outside pin community, and we're connecting. We've planned a retreat together. So it's kind of providing me a community that I haven't had for a decade that I've been like craving, and so it's been really cool. And people are emailing me, they're like, can I be an outside pin? And I'm like, let's talk about it. So it's just unfolded into this really incredible, and I have a team now that kind of help me with like executive functioning things. So we tell every outside pin, we're like, don't worry, Shelley's not running the show.
Just disclaimer.
Emails.
Not everybody who applies is going to get to be an outside pin.
Yes.
Say no, Shelley, say no.
I have the concepts, and then my team makes it happen. And so it's something that I'm really excited about because it's in the not now part of my brain for so long, and now it's in the now part of my brain, and it's
it sounds really exciting.
It's really fun.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
That's the new part of my life right now.
Yeah,
I love it.
So that being said, kind of thinking about where you're going, I just know that often our members kind of want to know where was that moment in your life where you thought that this is what you were going to do with your life?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. Like at what point were you just like, yeah, this is everything to me? Because it's very clear that you're extremely passionate about the work that you do, and you're really great at the work that you do. So when was that?
Can you talking about the now and now it's the then?
Was it an evolution?
That's it, right? There's probably 2. It's probably 2 because like there was the moment that I wanted to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And then there's the moment that I wanted to tell stories.
Well, tell us both.
Right? So I mean, if you've heard my story before, you'll know that I hated school. It was awful. Like there save for 1 year, I never felt like school was a place for me. I never felt smart. I never felt like I contributed. I never wanted to go. I have a learning disability. I have ADHD. Like school's not built for us. I also, I joke about it, but it's totally true. Like I also was a little gay and a little chubby. Like not the best, characteristics for Alberta in the 80s. And so I just never felt all the things you want kids to feel in an inclusive
Yeah.
place, right? And it just was like just I went because I had to, and was often in trouble and was labeled behavior and had my IEP, all the things. And then I had this revolutionary year at this kind of alternate school that changed my life and gave me a glimpse of what school could be. And I'm like, why did I have to wait till I was 13 to feel like I wanted to go to school and what was different about that place, right? And that really impacted me. And the teachers I had there really impacted me. Like all the teachers I had at that school, I'm still in contact with, right? And so that's when I wanted to be a teacher because I wanted to like do better by kids like me. I wanted to do better by kids who, were had challenging behavior, had learning disabilities, had ADHD, like single mom, like all the things that just the life was kind of the barriers around them all the time. And so that was when I went into special education, mostly because I wanted to blow it up, right? Because there's no inclusive ed option at the time. And so I did, and I went into special ed. And then what happened was in Alberta, you get a degree in special education. In BC, you don't get a degree in special education. You get a master's in special education.
Yeah.
And so it takes people longer to get those qualifications in BC. So they're so short. So when I moved to BC, they're like, you have a degree in special education. So I mean, like, but like, I also came from the mentality of Alberta where there's no jobs.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I left Alberta when, Ralph Klein was like, teachers, you're invited to leave. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
There was no job. So I came from that mentality that like I'm gonna have to TOC for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
So I'm subbing in BC and a principal calls me. She's like, "What are you doing on the sub list?" And I'm like, "Because I know there's no jobs for me. I'm a brand new teacher." She's like, "Don't talk to anyone else. Come in for an interview." And it was kind of one of those things. So the next day I go to an interview and she's like, "There are so many jobs for you." But I wasn't even looking. Like I didn't even think it was
You
possible.
just thought it's the same as Alberta.
It's the same as Alberta. And but because I had a degree, I was automatically more qualified than anyone who didn't have their master's, which is huge.
Yeah.
And so then I get this job working with students with intellectual disabilities, and I found my home. And I didn't anticipate that I would, like, I'd never worked with kids with intellectual disabilities before. And within a week, I was like, you guys have the answers to education. Like, what you need is what everyone needs. Like, are we locked in the corner because we're valuable? Because this is where the answers are, right? So it's like, and I just was like, I don't understand. Like, why? And so this is when the inclusion part of the conversation was unlocked because I was like, it doesn't make sense that we're in the corner.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense that no one knows we're here. It doesn't make sense we have our own entrance because we're awesome. They were and it was a high school, right? So like this is so common that kids are like, I can't even tell you where any kids with intellectual disabilities were in any school that I attended. I mean, they were there.
Yeah.
I can't tell you where. We never saw them. And I just
sight out of mind kind of
yeah,
thing.
and I couldn't. And once I actually was there, I was just like, you guys are the raddest. Like, you have so much to offer. Like, we got to get out of here. And so it was this whole long journey of figuring out what inclusion meant for this group of kids, right? And so that was really when the inclusion bug got me. And that would have been like early 2000s.
Yeah.
But just like you see it
before, like way before, like honestly, way before other people, really.
Yeah, I guess. I
Yeah.
guess I mean like in the context of BC specifically, like BC's special schools were closed down 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So like, there is no special education schools, and if they are, they're much more of congregated programs. I mean, they're not perfect, and we have a lot of work to do, but the systematic like what is it called? Like the closing down of segregated schools happened systematically like in the 90s, right?
Okay.
And so in terms of the physical location of children, just the fact that we were in the building was, I think, further along than because when I first was in New York, they were in a different district, not even in a different building, right? So I mean, in terms of the physical location, BC has done a really great job. They're really struggling right now. I think what a lot of people are struggling with is, okay, they're here now. What do we do? How do we do this in a manageable way? And so that kind of got the inclusion bug started in my brain. And then what happened is I had to get a master's, because if you don't have a master's in BC, you get paid like $4 an hour. So I was like, I'm going to go get a graduate diploma at least, but I didn't go back to school. I hated school. But I went to SFU. And if you don't know about SFU, SFU is this incredible comprehensive program built for teachers where it is so aligned to UDL, like you can express your learning in any way. And my master's thesis was a comic book, you know, and some people laugh about it and say that's not a real school, but it unlocked in me the first time that I felt like A, I was smart, but also B, that I had something to contribute, because how we started each class was we would all tell a story. And I was 28. And that's when I realized that I could tell stories. And so at the beginning of every class, my colleagues would be like, Shelley, start. We want to hear Shelley's stories first. And I was the shy kid wearing a toque.
No, Shelley, break the ice, break the
I
ice.
had no confidence at all. And these teachers who were 10, 20 years my senior doing their graduate work were like, start with Shelley's story, you know? And it's like this sense of like, I don't know, I'd never gotten feedback like that I was good at something. And so I just kind of leaned into that, and people started saying, hey, do some professional development for our district. And I did. And people just flocked to the story. And that's when I was like, I can tell stories. Like, that's a strength that I have. Like, what an incredible strength that is. But how sad is it that it took me till I was 28 to realize I had a strength? And then
We don't want our kids to feel that way.
No. And so then I was just like, okay, how do I use and model that you can have a strength to teach others, to help others? Because that really is what that inclusive idea is, right? Like, what are you good at and how does that help your community? As opposed to what are you bad at, how do you fix it? Because let me tell you, I have a list of things that are wrong with me. I could spend all day talking about it, because that's what's been valued, is what are the things you can't do.
Right.
And so to model this inclusive practice of find your strength and lean in.
Yeah.
It
That's
can take you a million places.
It's interesting that you say that as we're looking at, I mean, it's the beginning of the year, people are thinking about requirements and IPPs and things.
Yeah.
And what more does has in the past be focused on but what you can't do?
If
you have a diagnosed reading disability and your goal is going to be that you're going to improve your reading.
There's a mountain I die on, friends. It's gonna be
I will say I'm very happy.
Somebody's got to die on it for sure.
They take so many resources out of the classroom.
Yeah.
Building and writing and getting all the information and data you need for an IEP takes hours and funding and time out of the classroom and people out of the classroom. And you realize that those documents aren't even helpful to the teacher. They're for the auditors.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it is the biggest scam in education. So if we're going to do them, let's do them right.
Okay, so that being said, I know ours this year are going to be based on the competencies, which is exciting.
Great. Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to that. You talked lots about your early experience being with kiddos with intellectual disabilities, and I'll say for my experience, being a learning support teacher for a long time, I feel as though, for me anyway, and where we're at, a lot of our teachers are able to plan now to include those kids. I do think the feedback I get anyways is that our teachers are really struggling with the behaviors.
Yeah.
Of I know for our members too, hey girls, it continuously comes out for behavior support in our professional development. Like, can you give some PD on behavior support?
Yeah.
So I think that we've made a lot of growth. No, we're nowhere near perfect,
Yeah.
but I feel as though teachers are better able to plan, for kids on the margins when you're thinking about intellectual disability and things like that, and where they're really, really struggling is the complex behaviors and feeling that they don't have enough support for that.
Yeah.
So that continues to kind of be a focus and a need for everybody.
Oh, for sure. And those are the four biggest questions I get.
Yeah.
How do you handle challenging behavior? How do you handle anxiety? How do you handle disengagement? How do you handle non-attendance?
Yeah.
So what are your answers to all
None
that?
of my answers? Okay. I mean, I could talk about this for days because this is my job. I think that what's really tricky is that none of us grew up in inclusive contexts, right? And very few of us were taught to teach in truly inclusive contexts, right? So even as a special educator, I was not taught how to teach inclusively. I was taught to make a plan for where kids should be and then adapt and modify.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's how most of us were taught how to handle the diversity of a class. The tricky thing is that as diversity increases, if the only strategy we've been taught is to adapt and modify for the kids that don't fit, what do you do when no one fits? Right? And it becomes a retrofitting process that's really inefficient. Okay. And so when we are running around trying to adapt and modify for individual learners, what happens is there's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of waiting. And when there's a lot of waiting, there comes a lot of anxiety and challenging behavior and disengagement, right? And the other thing about adaptations and modifications is how do you know a student needs it? They have to not be successful. And 9 times out of 10, a student will show challenging behavior over showing that they can't do something.
Yeah.
Especially as they get older. And so part of the work around inclusion is really there's a thinking shift that needs to happen, but also a practice shift that needs to happen. And so the thinking shift is, and like this is not our fault. We were conditioned for this, which is if someone is struggling with all of the 4 above mentioned symptoms, right? We have been conditioned, well-meaning, to look at that student or that child and say something's wrong. Something's wrong. They're having challenging behavior because something's wrong. They're having anxiety because something is wrong. They're disengaged because something is wrong. They're not attending because something is wrong. And so then our resources go into trying to find out what's wrong. Okay. And it's not our fault. That's what we were trained to do. But the thing about behavior, especially, is that behavior in itself is not a need. Behavior is a symptom of a need not getting met. And you
Exactly.
can't actually determine what that need is until we stop assessing and diagnosing the student and start diagnosing and assessing the content. Okay, so this is the difference between 2 paradigms. One is called the medical model, which is how we all grew up, which is you go to the doctor when something is wrong, they assess you, they diagnose you, they make you a plan, and you get fixed. And then there's the social model, which is if someone is struggling and something is wrong, it's because there's stairs around them, there's a barrier around them that we have to figure out how to reduce. But there's actually a third model that's my favorite, and it's called the person place model of need. And that says a person's needs have less to do with their disability or their personhood and more to do with the place that they're in. So the example that I talk about is I went to Hong Kong before COVID, and I was really dependent there. Like I needed so much support there because I didn't speak the language, I didn't drive, I'd never been there before, I needed a host. So the organization anticipated these needs, and I had a driver, I had a translator, and I had a hostess who were with me all the time. So I had like 3 Hong Kong EAs following me around. Like I lost skills. Okay, I lost them. Like I wasn't independent at all. But also there was a lot of barriers in that context, right? And so that's how we've been trained. Is like if there's a barrier, let's add a person. Okay? And intuitively that feels like it would work, but then we have to kind of go back and say like there has to be some sort of goal of increasing skill and independence, which actually went backwards there. Okay? But if I say, okay, now the next week I'm in Toronto, Toronto has its own barriers, like mostly that they think they're the North, but regardless, I digress. Like their traffic is bananas, right? Like if you know, it gets renting a car, like just getting out of the parking lot of the rental airport is just a nightmare. But I've been there before. I can drive a car there. So I mean, I still need support, but I'm more independent there, not because I have people doing it for me, but because the context has less barriers. And then if I go to Edmonton, well, it's a whole different scenario. I grew up there. I know how to drive there. I understand how to drive on ice, right? All of these things. And so I have the least barriers in Edmonton because that's where I have the most experience and background knowledge. And so you look at these three different places. I'm the same person in all three of those places, right? But the support that I need in those places have less to do with me as a person and more to do with the barriers around me. But our entire special education formula doesn't look at the context at all. But that's where the impact is for independence, right? Because the less barriers that are around you, the more independent you'll be and the less resources you need. But we are trained to look at it the opposite, to say, if a person is struggling, let's put all the resources into the person.
Yeah.
So that leads us to a question that one of our people had was,
I love questions from the people.
With the decreasing supports that are available, such as assistants and paraprofessionals, how do you see educators leveraging the supports that they do as best as they can?
So this is a question, and I kind of saw this, like, you know, how do we do more with less? How do we do more with less? And that's a real question. I hate that it's a question because the fact that education isn't fully funded is criminal. But let's just get that out of, like, the goal should not be to do more with less. Like, let's just get that out of the way, okay? Because when we don't have enough, we grasp onto what we know, even if it's not aligned to what the actual goal is, okay? Because, like, I'll tell you, the number one resource that's asked for inclusive classrooms is adults, educational assistants. There's no research to support that. But in crisis, having another adult in the immediacy feels better. I totally get it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the lack of resources and put it in our pocket for a second and change the question to, if we were fully funded, what's the most optimal use of resources to support inclusive education? So that when resources are stripped unethically, we know what to advocate for that will make the biggest difference, okay? So if we look at what research says makes the biggest difference for not just student growth and well-being, but also teacher management and work management, the number one factor in the research that impacts teacher workload is not EAs, it's not class size, it's not class composition, it's collaboration with another person, right? Because there has been this very strange assumption that teachers have to do this work alone. And I see it all the time. And it's a travesty because that puts them in such an unfair situation. So, like, there are teachers that I've talked to who became a teacher and have never worked with a child with a disability before. And now the doors are opening. We're dumping all these kids in and closing the door, being like, it's inclusion, go. And it completely is contaminating what inclusion means and how to actually do it. And so people push back against it. And I used to think for a long time that people didn't support inclusion, but that's not what it is.
No.
It's that they don't know what to do and they don't have the resources to do it. And I get that. But then in our advocacy, what I think is probably the most important part is in our advocacy, when we're advocating for resources to support inclusion, we have to look at what the research shows will actually make a difference. Because what we're advocating for is what we feel like we need or what we have opinions and experience about in terms of what we need. But, like, you can add 10 people to a classroom.
Then you're managing 10 adults.
Not everyone's useful, right? And I think, like, you know, I think about inclusion like almost like a family model, like let's have a support teacher and a classroom teacher working together to support everyone. That will always have a bigger impact of workload than trying to divide and conquer between 5, 6, 7, and 8 adults.
Yeah.
Because then the classroom teacher is not only managing kids, they're managing the adults. right? And we know that our educational assistants don't get enough training. We know that they are the least trained to work with students with the most needs. And so if we're really talking about how to decrease workload, it's not just the adults. And don't get me wrong, we need educational assistants, but then we also put them in a really awkward position to like do programming for kids that they're not trained to do. And so if we are lucky enough to get an EA, and I would put an EA in every classroom if I could, to have 3 people, a classroom teacher, a support teacher, and an EA working together to support the diversity of an entire class, that is going to decrease the workload of teachers. And so in our advocacy, when resources are short, the most optimal use of resources is not adding a person, it's adding collaboration. And that is what we have to hold on to, because that will make the impact.
Right. Hannah, that's where we're like, as a division with our Hannah's LST this year for our division.
Yeah.
We're putting, and we did work with you last year, Shelley. We're like, our LSTs now are going to have time embedded in their schedule. So we hired lots more LSTs because we're really committed to this responsive planning. And so they're going to have time in their schedule, and teachers will have time where they can do it embedded in. We're not asking them to stay after school because they're already overwhelmed.
No, there's no room on that.
We're giving the gift of like trained teachers with experience to collaborate with classroom teachers.
But I'm also going to say, we have to really be careful about the difference between resources and supports, right? Like time, people, and funding are resources, but they're only as good as how they're used. There's a lot of funding that's not useful. There's a lot of people that's not useful. There's a ton of time that's not useful. And so like creating the space for time and people to come together is really, really key. And I love that infrastructural shift. And so then the next part is how are we providing opportunity for that time to be useful? And so if you look at the second indicator for what do teachers need to do this work in a manageable way, it's facilitated collaborative professional development, right? Like it's not just about putting 2 people in a room together saying, okay, 45 minutes go. This is about, okay, in September, this is what we're doing. We're getting to know our learners. We're learning about who they are, their strengths, their stretches, their needs. Let's do it together in this time that's not after school. And so, you know, like time for them to come together, facilitated practical professional development that they have over time. The impact is going to be massive and so much bigger than just adding another body.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, to my ears. I'm crying tears of inclusion.
I'm conscious of the time. It's always our time goes so fast with you. I'm gonna get Hannah, maybe you could ask maybe a question or two from our members that sent in questions. That last question was from Kelsey. So thanks, Kelsey, for sending that in.
Kelsey.
Not me, somebody else.
Not that Kelsey, but
not me. Somebody else.
Kelsey. Thank you, Kelsey.
A few Kelseys and a few Jens.
Thank you, Kelsey's plural. You know?
Hannah, if you want to grab a question from the list and pick that out, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, we talked a little bit about getting everybody involved in the classroom. This is parents. You talked about your outside pins, and we had a question that kind of revolved around your exciting journey as a parent. And it comes from Melissa, and she asks, how has becoming a parent changed or impacted how you support educators with inclusion?
That's a really, really good question.
Yeah.
The number one thing that I've realized is that parenting is so hard.
Yes, it is
hard. Like
I have a son with autism, and trust me, it is hard.
People make it look so easy, especially on the internet. Parenting, it's so hard. And I'm like, I'm a high school teacher. Now I have this 3-year-old, and like I just spent 25 minutes talking about how like we have to change the conditions around the children. Every day I ask my wife, she needs to be assessed. Something's wrong with her. Like toddlers are crazy. Okay, moving on. So I've learned that parenting is really hard, and I've also learned that everyone is doing best by their kid.
Yeah.
Right.
Always.
And I think this has been really important because I remember parents coming to me before I was a parent and being like, I'm pulling my kid from education. I can't do this anymore. I'm sending them to a special school. And I'd be like, don't do it. It's not worth it. You know what I mean? Like the good fight. And then I realized once I became a parent that I'm wearing two hats. I'm wearing an advocate hat and I'm wearing a parent hat. And at the end of Tuesday, if my kid is not growing and feeling good and standing tall at the place that they're in, I'm absolutely going to pull them because my child is not worth the fight and I'm not going to sacrifice them for the fight. And so whenever people ask me that question now, I say, okay, do you want me to answer this as a parent or do you want me to answer this?
Which hat would you like?
Yeah. As a parent, I'm going to tell you, you do what's best for your family. You do what's best for your kids. And if that means that they're in a different context, if that means that they're homeschooled, if that means that they join some hiking, hockey, flying program, you do what's right for your kids and your family. As an advocate, I will never stop fighting so that kids don't have to leave. Right? Because like, I mean, if it were up to me, there would be an inquiry every time a kid left your school. Do you know what I mean? I think we put so much focus on closing down the separate schools instead of thinking, why are they leaving the first school to start with, right? Like a whole inquiry to say, why are these programs popping up? Why are these schools for autism popping up? Why are these specialized? Those are not the problem. The problem is that people are so desperate for their kids' needs to be met that they create a whole new culture and community for them because that was the best option. And I think that's the part that I didn't get was that when leaving is the best option, we got to make the first option better. And so I will always fight for inclusive schools till the day that I die. But if my kids ever need to leave, I won't even think twice about pulling them.
Yeah.
Because it's all the time you're balancing that act. Yeah. And that's the part that I didn't get before I was a parent.
Awesome. I love your answer.
Good question. I love it.
Oh man, it was a big curve. It was a big curve.
Oh yeah. I'm not a parent and I recently housed some family for a while and took on that role. And I was like, nope. No, thank you.
I am a parent
yeah,
and I am a parent of a child with multiple diagnoses, and I have a son with autism who is going to be labeled the behavior kid. And it is hard. It is hard to have both hats as an advocate and as a teacher, and then to also see your kids struggle.
Oh, before I was a parent, I was just like, I will sacrifice my children for the sake of inclusion. No, I won't. And I didn't get that. I'll sacrifice myself. Like, throw me under the bus. You can be mad at me. You can have Twitter fights with me. I can take it. But my 3-year-old is perfect.
There you have it, folks.
Love it.
Okay, Kelsey, maybe shout out to someone else who asked a question quickly for Shelley before we wrap up here.
Yeah, so one question I think I'm curious about is assessments and looking at designing assessment for, and this person used your slogan, outside pins. So how do we ensure our assessments are designed for the outside pins and for
I love this question because I didn't even know that I had a passion for curriculum and assessment until recently. I mean, recently within the last 5 years, because as special educators, you're not taught about curriculum and assessment, but I'm going to tell you a secret, folks. In special education, you're taught that inclusion lies within the accommodations. How do we support kids? But I don't think that's where the answer is. I think if we design our curriculum and assessment accessibly enough, you don't need accommodations. And so this has become like a secret that I feel like more people need to know. And so I've dove into the literature on curriculum and assessment, and my mind is blown because this is where inclusion lives. And so as a quick little nutshell, here we go. Inclusive education in both curriculum design and assessment design, it relies on standards-based design. Okay, we have to let go of standardization. And even though there are specific contexts where standardization does play a role, nowhere in Canada are those high stakes, right? Like they're annoying stakes. And so when we're talking about actual teaching and learning time, not testing time, teaching and learning time, planning and designing, and this is all ages, right? Looking at curriculum and assessment from a standards-based approach. And what I mean when I say that is that we have to know what the learning standard is. Because once we know the learning standard, we can pull in universal design for learning principles and strategies that say, what are the different ways to get there? And just that little switch blows open curriculum and assessment for so many kids. And the reason why that's hard, though, is because what I was taught was not to know the goal. What I was taught was to know the task. And if a student doesn't know the task or can't do the task, then we adapt and modify the task. And then you have to actually create a whole nother activity and a whole nother assessment for this one kid, which is not efficient. And so part of the work that I'm doing with schools is, okay, whatever the grade is, whatever the subject is, let's look for the learning standards. Let's look at different ways to get that standard. And if we really want to take it to the edges, and this is my research area, right? Like, how do we even talk about the edges when we're talking about kids with intellectual disabilities and kids that are profoundly gifted, who are so outside of the grade band? What does that mean? What does that look like? Does it mean we have to send them away to robotics camp once a month or send them away to do life skills down the hall? What does it truly mean to create a curricular and assessment plan that aligns to the range or reflects the range of learners? And so, you know, the work that I did with schools, because my research was in high school, academic classrooms, to say, what's our grade level learning standard? And then how do we create an accessible access point? And so, you know, kind of shifting away from this kind of linear prerequisite way that we were taught, like, you can't do that until you know this, you can't do that until you know this, and instead thinking about curriculum and learning standards as concepts. Once we understand them as concepts, you realize they're so much more accessible. And a great example of this is if you think about the Science 10 curriculum and kids are learning about the periodic table of elements, right? I had a student with Down syndrome who was enrolled in a Science 10 class, and the teacher was just like, okay, like, how am I going to make this accessible? Like, he doesn't even know the letters of the alphabet. How is he going to understand the periodic table of elements? And so from a linear sequential way, it's hard to figure out how to plan for that, let alone assess that. But if you think about it conceptually and you can say, okay, well, why is anyone learning about the periodic table of elements? Like, why is this in the curriculum? And if you keep asking why at least 5 times, you get to the concept, which is the world is organized. And once we got to that, we're like, that is not a grade 10 concept. That's a life concept, right? And so we were able to make the periodic table of elements showing the kids that this is how the world is organized. There's heavy and there's light and there's gases and there's non-gases and there's metals and there's non-metals, which everybody could understand, right? And so when we were assessing our little guy with Down syndrome, we were assessing about what are the different ways the world is organized, which is the concept of the periodic table. And that is actually what everyone needs to understand, because if the other students also don't understand that, it becomes just a compliance activity. I'm going to memorize that Fe is iron, as opposed to understanding that this is connected to a larger structure. And so the difference between kind of making learning standards accessible and modifying something is that an accessible learning standard is derived from grade level, whereas a modification is a simplified grade level task. And so if it's a simplified grade level task, it's not going to help anybody else. But if you have an accessible version of the goal, that's a concept, that's not simple, that's bigger. And so talking about the efficiency of curriculum design and moving away from adaptations and modification takes a lot of conversation around the concept of learning standards and thinking this isn't just for this kid anymore. And that universal design aspect of, if we can make this accessible for anyone, it's going to be accessible for everybody. And as kids get older, there are so many kids that can follow formulas and can do all the tasks, and they have no idea what pi is, because we're focusing on tasks instead of focusing on learning goals and concepts. And so I really like the structure of Alberta's new curriculum. It's not, I mean, like, I wish there was like a combination of like the new and the new. Anyways, I digress. The point is, the most important part of the shift in the curriculum was that all subject areas now follow the same curricular model. And so it's really nice to be able to pull in concepts that are cross-curricular and make accessible, and they're organized by questions. Like, there's some really beautiful pieces to it that facilitate this type of planning. And so when you're talking about assessment, the best advice I can give you is know your learning goal, make an accessible version of it or a challenging version of it, and then open it up to say, what are the different ways we can get here? And if we do those two things, every kid in our system can meet a learning standard. And that is the complete opposite of the narrative that we've been told about students. So it's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Well, we only have a few more minutes, so
You're so fun.
we're gonna ask you one last kind of question. Okay.
Yeah.
And we really, really are very thankful for your time with us.
Oh,
Like
it's been so fun.
our mission as a council is to try and provide our members with professional development in the areas of their need. So you also help us to then go out and help. And so we really appreciate that. So our last question for you today is, what do you hope our listeners, our members of the Council for Inclusive Education take away from the conversation about the importance and impact that they're having and of inclusive education in general?
I think the message that I would love people hold on to, because I know it's frustrating. I know it feels like it's an impossible task. I know that. I know that there's not enough. I know that. I think that the message that I really want people to hold on to is that, like, the students are not the problem here. Right? Like, the diversity is not the problem. The variability is not the problem. It's the conditions around it that need to change, not the actual students. And so, when we're talking about inclusive education, what that means is, in our advocacy, we can't advocate to change the kids. We can advocate to change the conditions. And if there's one thing that I want people to hold on to, it's that, because so often kids get into the bargaining instead of the conditions. And I know it's sensitive, and I know I get in trouble for this, but as long as we try to change who's sitting in our class, diversity will always be a burden. And if we truly want to lean into the celebration of diversity, we have to teach who's in front of us. We have to teach the students that reflects the community that we're in. And that may mean we need a heck of a lot of resources to support them, but the advocacy around changing the conditions is where that impact is going to be, not trying to change who's sitting in front of us. And that brings up conversations about ability groupings and streaming and class composition. And I know those are sensitive conversations. And so whenever and I had to learn this too, but whenever we're talking about those high emotional areas, those topics that evoke so many emotions that you start to burn and have Twitter fights, I think part of it is taking a step back and being like, okay, what does the research say about this? So that when we advocate for the resources that are already slim, we're using them in ways that make the biggest difference for kids and for adults. And because I know teachers aren't supported enough. So let's make sure that when we get resources, because you must, they're being used they're going to be used in ways that have the biggest impact. And that's what I hope people grab onto in conversations about inclusion.
Yeah, thank you. All right, thanks so much. We really appreciate you. I'm sure we'll see you down the road at some point in our planning. We're looking to do some new planning about our direction, and I'll end with this, because we are the Council for Inclusive Education. There still exists this like special education part for us. And so as a council, what we're hoping to do this year, we got a lot of new people on executive, a lot of fresh ideas. We're hoping that we broaden like our work with other people and other groups, so that we're bringing kind of like you, actually, when you're talking about other people have these perspectives. I don't have that perspective. So we're hoping to collaborate with other people to do the same thing that you're doing in your work, really. So that's funny. And just make sure we're getting other people's perspectives from all kinds of diverse groups.
Well, special education is still very much needed. I mean, it's not about losing that aspect. It's a perspective that's key. It's an expertise that's key. And it's looking at, inclusive education is a space for the specialists and a place for the generalists to come together. And so to create a committee that includes the specialists and the generalists to come together, like, that is exactly what education is. So you got it. You're nailing it.
We're on the right track. Yeah. Cool. Thanks so much for joining us.
Go have a great day.
Yeah, well, it's the end of the day.
It's a great day to have a great day.
It's 5:30 after a Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a great week.
Yes, yes, there you
And
go.
I appreciate all the work you do. Thank you for
Thanks.
everything that you do for kids and for teachers, and it's worth its weight in gold, my friends.
Perfect.
Thank you. That's so
Bye,
nice.
guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
As an organization, the ATA promotes and is committed to respecting human rights and ensuring a safe and secure and healthy environment for all. The Alberta Teachers Association works to ensure that all present at or participating in ATA programs and events are protected from violence and harassment. All ATA members are therefore expected to promote and defend the fundamental human rights of everyone engaged in ATA programs, activities, or other ATA work. ATA members are expected to treat one another with fairness, respect, and dignity, and uphold the highest standards of professionalism, accountability, competence, and integrity as representatives of the provincial association, as well as their respective locals and subgroups. Furthermore, the ATA members are obligated to act to prevent violence and harassment wherever possible and to report to the appropriate person in authority and suspected breaches of this statement that comes to their attention. We would like to thank you for joining us on our first episode of Season 2 of the Inclusive Chronicles. See you next month.